I remember the day I stopped being human, though I did not know it then. The understanding came later, in fragments, like shattered glass reflecting a truth too terrible to grasp all at once. My name was something once. I think it began with a hard consonant, something that felt solid in the mouth, but names are luxuries for those who still possess the delusion of individual worth. In the Imperium of man, there are only functions, only purposes assigned by those who serve the God Emperor's grand design. I write this now with hands that no longer quite feel like my own, in moments stolen between the endless liturgies, because some part of me, some stubborn, screaming fragment refuses to be erased completely. If you find these words, know that I was real once. Know that I chose this, in the way a drowning man chooses to grasp at chains. The hive city of my birth rose like a rusted prayer to absent gods, its spires clawing at a sky choked with industrial smoke, and the exhaust of a billion souls packed into spaces meant for half that number. I grew up in the mid-levels, where the air was thick enough to see but thin enough to breathe without coughing blood a privilege. I learned, though it felt like suffocation. My parents worked the assembly lines in Manufacturum District Sigma 7, their backs bent by 30 years of service, their lungs blackened by the sacred fumes of imperial industry. They spoke of the Emperor with the weary devotion of those who had never known anything else, their prayers mechanical as the work of their hands. I can still hear my father's voice in the mornings, rough as grinding gears, reciting the litany of labor before his rations. In toil there is redemption. In service there is grace. We are the hands that build his Imperium. My mother would mouth the words silently, her eyes focused on nothing, or perhaps on everything, the endless tomorrow that looked exactly like yesterday. I was 23 standard years when the recruiters came to our district, though I felt ancient already, worn down by the monotony of sorting components in sub-level 12, where the lights flickered with epileptic frequency and the temperature never rose above freezing. The recruiters wore robes of deep crimson, trimmed with gold thread that caught the dim lumens and seemed to glow within a fire. Their faces were hidden behind masks shaped like weeping angels, and they moved through the crowds with a grace that seemed impossible in the cramped corridors of the mid-hive. They carried censers that trailed sweet smoke, not the acrid chemical fog we breathed daily, but something else, something that made the air taste of distant gardens and forgotten dreams. People stopped to stare. We could not help ourselves. Beauty was a rumor in our world, something that existed only in propaganda vids and the gilded shrines we could never afford to enter. The lead recruiter's voice was like honey poured over broken glass, smooth and cutting at once. "Children of the Emperor," they intoned, and the words seemed to bypass my ears entirely, resonating in my chest like a second heartbeat. "You toil in darkness, faithful servants of the Imperium, your labors unsung but not unnoticed. The God Emperor watches all. He sees your devotion. He knows your suffering. And for the worthy, for the truly faithful, he offers transcendence." The word hung in the recycled air like incense smoke. Transcendence. I had never heard it spoken aloud before, though I had read it in the prayer scrolls, always in the context of death, of service beyond the flesh. But the way this masked figure spoke it, it sounded like a promise of life, real life, not the slow grinding death we called existence. They told us of the Redemptionist Conclave, a holy order devoted to the God Emperor's most sacred mysteries, operating from a monastery fortress in the upper spires, where the air was clean and the light was real sunlight, filtered through stained glass, depicting his glory. They spoke of purpose beyond the assembly line, of brotherhood and sisterhood forged in shared devotion, of secrets passed down through 10,000 years of faithful service. They promised training in the sacred texts, access to relics touched by saints, the opportunity to serve in ways that mattered, that would be remembered. "Your names," the recruiter said, and I felt my heart constrict, "will be inscribed in the book of the faithful. Your deeds will echo through eternity. You will become part of something greater than yourselves, part of the Emperor's living will." I should have seen it then. The promises were too vast, too beautiful for the likes of us. In the Imperium, gifts come with prices, and beauty masks only the most terrible transactions. But I was young and desperate, and tired of the cold and the flickering lights and the taste of metal shavings in my evening rations. I was tired of being nothing, of knowing I would die in that frozen sublevel, and my body would be rendered into protein paste to feed someone equally meaningless. When the recruiter extended a hand gloved in crimson silk, the fingers impossibly long, I took it. So did 30 others from our district. We signed our names in the registry they provided, a massive tome bound in what they said was synthetic leather, but felt disturbingly warm and supple under my palm. The paper was thick, yellow with age, and the ink we used smelled of copper and salt. My parents did not try to stop me. They could not meet my eyes when I told them. My father simply nodded, his face empty of expression, and my mother whispered a prayer I did not recognize. "May he keep your soul," she said, and I thought it an odd blessing at the time. Now I understand. Now I would give anything to have heeded the resignation in her voice, the way her hands shook as she made the sign of the Aquila over my head. But I was already gone, already imagining the upper spires and the clean air and a life that meant something beyond survival. The transport to the upper levels came at night. We were told to bring nothing, all our needs would be provided for in our new life. I remember the feeling of ascending, of the elevator platform rising through the hive's levels, each one slightly less oppressed than the last. The air grew cleaner by degrees. The walls showed less rust. The lighting steadied, brightened. By the time we reached the upper spires, I felt drunk on oxygen, my head spinning with the novelty of breathing without effort. The other recruits, I did not know them, not really. Though we had all lived within kilometers of each other our whole lives, they looked equally dazed, equally hopeful. We smiled at each other, tentative, like children expecting punishment for joy. The monastery fortress of the Redemptionist conclave was nothing like the shrines I had known. Those were functional spaces, bare rockcrete chambers with a single Aquila, and perhaps a candle if the district had met its production quotas. This was something else entirely, a cathedral carved from the hive's very bone, its ceilings lost in shadows that seemed to move and breathe, its walls covered in frescoes depicting the emperor's glory in pigments that glowed with their own light. The air was thick with incense, a dozen varieties I could not name, their smoke curling in patterns that almost seemed deliberate, almost seemed to form words in languages I did not know. The floor was polished black stone, so smooth it reflected like water, and as we walked across it, I saw my face staring up at me, distorted and strange, as if I were looking at someone else entirely. We were led to the chamber of welcoming, a vast circular room whose walls were lined with alcoves, each containing a statue of a hooded figure in prayer. The lead recruiter, I later learned their title was Shepherd of Souls, gestured for us to kneel in a circle at the room's center. We obeyed, the stone cold through my worn trousers, and I felt a moment of vertigo as I realized I could see the ceiling here. It was painted as a night sky, stars rendered in silver leaf, and at its center was the Aquila, wings spread so wide they seemed to embrace the entire room. "You have chosen ascension," the shepherd intoned, and I noticed for the first time how their voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing from the walls, the floor, the air itself. "You have chosen to rise above the mundane, to become instruments of his divine will. But first, you must be purified. First, you must die to your old selves." The ceremony began with prayer. This I expected. We recited the catechism of faith, the litany of devotion, the creed of sacrifice. My knees ached after the first hour, screamed after the second, went numb after the third. The incense grew thicker, and I realized they were closing the chamber's doors, sealing us in with the smoke and the chanting. My head swam, my eyes watered. Next to me, a woman who might have been my age or twice it, I could not tell in the uncertain light, began to sway, her words slurring into a continuous drone of sound that might have been high Gothic or might have been something older. I tried to focus on the shepherd's voice, on the familiar words of the prayers, But they were changing now, shifting into forms I did not recognize, syllables that caught in my throat, like thorns. Then came the first anointing. Acolytes emerged from the alcoves. When had they been there? I had not seen them enter carrying vessels of oil that gleamed gold in the candlelight. They moved around our circle, touching their fingers to our foreheads, our lips, our throats, leaving trails of warmth that quickly turned to burning. The oil smelled of flowers, but underneath was something else, something organic and coppery. I gasped as it touched my skin, the sensation too intense, too intimate. The woman next to me made a sound between a sob and a laugh. Across the circle, a man began to shake uncontrollably, his mouth open in silent prayer or scream. "The flesh is weak," the shepherd said, and we repeated it, our voices ragged. "The flesh is temporary. The flesh is a prison from which we beg release." With each repetition, the words felt more true, more necessary. I looked down at my hands, and they seemed foreign suddenly, meat and bone and nothing more, unworthy vessels for the soul that the Emperor had seen fit to grant me. The burning from the oil spread, crawling down my spine, radiating through my limbs. I wanted to tear at my skin, to shed it like a coat that no longer fit. The ceremony continued through the night, or what I assumed was night. There were no windows in that chamber, no way to track time's passage except by the mounting exhaustion in my bones and the increasing strangeness of the prayers. We confessed our sins, the mundane failures of our previous lives, moments of doubt, of laziness, of desire for things beyond our station. The shepherd accepted each confession with a nod, adding them to a scroll that seemed to write itself, the words appearing in script that burned with inner light. I confessed that I had once stolen an extra ration bar, that I had harbored resentment toward my supervisor, that I had doubted the Emperor's plan when my sister died of lung rot at age 14. Each confession felt like removing a stone from my chest, leaving me lighter and emptier. When dawn came, we were told it was dawn. Though we could not see it, we were led to the chambers of purification. These were smaller rooms, each containing a basin of water so cold it steamed in the warm air of the upper spire. We were instructed to disrobe, to leave our old clothing in piles to be burned, and to submerge ourselves completely. The water was agony, so cold it felt like burning, and I had to force myself under the surface 3 times, as instructed, holding my breath until my lungs screamed. When I surfaced the last time, gasping and shaking, an acolyte wrapped me in a robe of rough crimson fabric that scratched against my skin like penance. My old clothes were already gone, taken away while I was underwater, and I felt a lurch of panic at their loss, before remembering I had nothing in the pockets, no possessions worth keeping. I had already left everything behind. The first weeks in the conclave were a blur of ritual and instruction. We rose before dawn, real dawn, which we could see through narrow windows of stained glass that turned the sunlight red and gold, to attend Lauds, the first prayer service of the day. We chanted until our voices cracked, prostrated ourselves until our foreheads bled from striking the stone floor, held our arms outstretched in the sign of the Aquila until our muscles spasmed and failed. Between prayers came lessons in theology, taught by hollow-eyed priests who spoke in monotones about the Emperor's divinity, about the corruption of the alien and the mutant and the heretic, about the absolute necessity of faith and obedience. We learned the proper forms of devotion, the correct pronunciation of prayers in High Gothic and other languages whose names we were not given. We learned to identify holy symbols and to recognize the signs of corruption in text, in architecture, in flesh. The food was better than I had known in my previous life, though it tasted of nothing. We ate in silence in a refectory whose walls were bare except for a single massive fresco of the Emperor enthroned in glory, his gaze seeming to follow each of us as we moved. The rations were protein paste and nutri-wafers, but they were clean, untainted by the chemical aftertaste of recycled biomatter. We drank water that did not need to be boiled first, did not leave sediment at the bottom of the cup. My body responded to the nutrition with a vigor I had forgotten was possible. I felt stronger, clearer, more present in my own flesh, even as we were taught daily to despise that same flesh as weak and corruptible. Sleep was brief and troubled. We were housed in cells barely large enough for a cot and a small shrine, the walls so thin I could hear the prayers and sobs of my neighbors through the night. I lay awake often, staring at the ceiling of my cell where someone had scratched words in a language I could not read, my mind racing with the day's lessons, with the weight of revelation piling upon revelation. I learned that the Emperor was not merely the ruler of mankind but its creator and sustainer, that every breath we drew was his gift, that every thought we had was a reflection of his will or a corruption to be purged. I learned that I was less than nothing, that my existence was justified only by service, that even my suffering was a form of prayer if offered with proper devotion. These truths settled into my bones like cold water, reshaping me from within. The other recruits and I did not bond as I had imagined we might. The conclave discouraged particular friendships, teaching us that all were equal in the Emperor's eyes, and that to show preference was a form of pride. We were assigned rotating partners for prayer and study, never the same person 2 days in a row. I learned 100 names and forgot them all, faces blurring together in crimson robes and shared exhaustion. Sometimes I would catch someone's eye during prayer and see a reflection of my own uncertainty, my own fear. But we were never alone long enough to speak of it. The acolytes watched us always, their presence a constant reminder that deviation from the prescribed path would be noted and corrected. The corrections, when they came, were called redemptions. I witnessed my first in the second week. A recruit, a young man with burn scars on his hands from his previous life in some industrial hell, had been caught hoarding food, hiding Nutri-wafers under his cot against some imagined future deprivation. The discovery happened during one of the daily cell inspections, carried out by stone-faced acolytes who touched nothing but saw everything. We were summoned to the Chapel of Penitence to witness his redemption. The chapel was smaller than the main sanctuary, its walls bare stone weeping with moisture, its only ornament a massive iron aquila whose wings bore hooks and blades. The young man was brought in naked, his skin pale and goose-pimpled in the cold air, and made to kneel before the assembled conclave. The shepherd of souls, whose masked face I had not seen uncovered since that first night, spoke the charges. Hoarding is doubt. Doubt is the first seed of heresy. The Emperor provides all that is needed. To seek more is to deny his providence. The words echoed in the small space, seeming to press down on us from all sides. The young man wept, swore his devotion, begged forgiveness. The shepherd nodded, mercifully, and gestured to the acolytes. They brought forward a whip, its leather thongs tipped with small metal beads, and handed it to the young man himself. Redemption comes through, suffering willingly embraced, the shepherd intoned. 10 lashes, administered by your own hand, to remind the flesh of its weakness and the spirit of its duty. I watched as he whipped himself, each stroke laying open the skin of his back. The sound of impact, somehow worse than his screams. The blood ran down his spine in dark rivulets, pooling on the floor beneath him. We were made to watch, forbidden to look away or close our eyes. This was our lesson, that pain was purification, that suffering was grace, that in the breaking of the body, the soul was made stronger. When it was done, when the young man collapsed forward into his own blood, the shepherd blessed him, and the acolytes carried him away to the chambers of recovery. We never saw him again. I do not know if he survived his wounds, or if his redemption was complete in death. We were not told, and we knew better than to ask. After that, I did not transgress. I followed every rule precisely, devoted myself to prayer with an intensity born of terror. I watched the others do the same, all of us becoming more quiet, more compliant, more desperate to prove our faith. The days blended together, marked only by the liturgical hours and the slow attrition of our numbers. Some recruits vanished in the night, summoned for reasons we were not given. Some collapsed during prayer and were carried away. Some simply disappeared, their cells empty at morning inspection, their names struck from the rolls as if they had never been. We learned not to ask, not to wonder, not to remember. In the Imperium, people were as disposable as ammunition, and the conclave was merely teaching us what we should have always known. The first time I saw the inner sanctum was 2 months after my arrival, though by then my sense of time had become uncertain, measured only by the relentless cycle of prayer and sleep and prayer again. I had been selected along with 5 others whose faces had become familiar in the way that all faces were familiar now, interchangeable parts of the same machine for advancement to the next level of initiation. We were told we had proven our devotion, demonstrated the necessary purity of faith. I felt no pride at this, only a dull anxiety about what new trials awaited. The shepherd led us through corridors I had not seen before, deeper into the monastery fortress, past chambers whose functions I could only guess at from the sounds that emerged, chanting, machinery, screaming that might have been prayer or might have been something else. The inner sanctum was a temple within the temple, a space carved from living rock rather than built from the hive's manufactured materials. The walls were stone, dark and glistening with moisture, covered in bas-reliefs that depicted the emperor's great works, the unification of terror, the Great Crusade, the battle against traitor sons whose faces had been systematically defaced. The air here was different, heavier, tasting of metal and something organic I could not identify. At the room's center stood an altar of black stone, and upon it rested what we were told was a holy relic, a fragment of ceramite from a space marine's armor, blessed by contact with the Emperor's chosen warriors. It gleamed dully in the candlelight, a shard of something greater than ourselves, proof that the stories were real, that divinity walked among men. We were instructed to kneel before the altar, to place our hands upon the stone and open ourselves to the Emperor's presence. I did so, my palms flat against rock that felt unnaturally warm, and I tried to pray, tried to feel the connection to the divine that I had been promised. At first, there was nothing, just the ache in my knees and the sound of my own breathing. Then, gradually, I became aware of a sensation like pressure in my skull, a presence that seemed to press against the inside of my thoughts. It was not gentle. It was vast and cold and utterly indifferent, and I realized with a shock of terror that this was not the Emperor's love as it had been described in the prayers and the propaganda. This was power, pure and merciless, the weight of 10,000 years of conquest and faith and endless, grinding war. I tried to pull my hands away but found I could not move, could not even close my eyes. The shepherd's voice came from somewhere far away. Open yourselves to his will. Surrender your minds to his purpose. You are nothing. He is everything. In this understanding lies salvation. I felt something shift inside my skull, felt my thoughts rearranging themselves like puzzle pieces forced into new configurations. I tried to hold on to myself, onto the person I had been, but that person was already so diminished, already so worn down by months of prayer and deprivation and fear. The presence pressed harder, and I felt myself fragmenting, felt the boundaries of my identity dissolving like salt in water. For a moment that might have been seconds or hours, I was part of something larger, something that used human minds the way my body used cells, unconsciously, automatically, with complete disregard for the individual components. Then the pressure released, and I fell forward onto the altar, gasping and weeping, and changed in ways I did not yet understand. The others had similar experiences, though we did not speak of them afterward. Words felt inadequate. Suspect. We had been touched by something that language could not encompass, had been shown a truth that could not be articulated without diminishing it. We stumbled back to our cells in silence, each of us locked in private revelation or trauma, I still cannot say which. I lay awake that night, staring at the scratched ceiling, trying to remember who I had been before the ceremony, before the conclave, before any of this. My name still eluded me. My parents' faces had become generic, placeholder images rather than specific memories. My previous life seemed not like something that had happened to me but like a story I had heard about someone else, a character whose experiences I had been told but never lived. The next phase of our training began the following morning. We were introduced to the confession engine, a device of brass and wire and pulsing organic components that the tech priests maintained in a chamber adjacent to the inner sanctum. It resembled a throne, or perhaps an interrogation chair, bristling with sensors and neural interfaces that gleamed in the dim red light. We were told that the engine would help us identify and purge any remaining impurities in our faith, any hidden doubts or heresies that might corrupt us from within. Each of us would spend an hour connected to the engine, our thoughts monitored and analyzed, our devotion measured against absolute standards. Those who passed would be granted the mark of the conclave, tattooed over their hearts as proof of their purity. Those who failed would be taken for additional purification, though the nature of this purification was not specified. I was the third to be called. The acolytes strapped me into the throne with leather restraints that smelled of sweat and fear, tightened them until I could barely breathe. The neural interfaces were cold against my temples, my wrists, the base of my skull, their touch raising immediate headaches that pulsed in time with my heartbeat. A tech priest in oil-stained robes muttered prayers to the machine god as they activated the engine, and I felt the device come alive around me, felt its attention turn inward, felt it begin to sift through my thoughts like a customs agent searching luggage. The sensation was violating, intimate, in a way that made my skin crawl. I tried to think pure thoughts, to focus on prayers and devotion, but the harder I tried, the more my mind wandered to forbidden territories. Doubts about the conclave's methods, memories of my old life that I should have forgotten, questions about the nature of the Emperor himself. The engine found them all. Each doubt, each question, each moment of uncertainty was illuminated and examined, held up to some merciless standard I could not perceive. I felt my own thoughts turned against me, weaponized, proof of my unworthiness. The tech priest's binaric chanting grew faster, more urgent, and I realized with mounting horror that I was failing, that I was being revealed as corrupt, as heretical, as worthy only of purging. I screamed, I think I screamed, though I could not hear my own voice over the roar of the engine and the accusations echoing in my skull. Then, abruptly, it stopped. The interfaces withdrew, the restraints released. I fell forward onto the floor, vomiting bile and shaking uncontrollably. The tech priest consulted a data slate, their augmetic eyes whirring as they processed information I could not see. The shepherd stood watching, their masked face impossible to read. Finally, after a silence that seemed to stretch for hours, they nodded. "Acceptable," the tech priest said in a voice that was more machine than human. "Corruption present, but minimal. Purification protocols, standard indoctrination, plus supplemental prayer cycles. Mark this one for advancement." I wanted to weep with relief, but I had no tears left, no energy for emotion. I was simply glad to have survived, glad that my doubts had been catalogued as acceptable rather than damning, glad that I would not disappear in the night like the others. The tattooing came 3 days later, after I had recovered enough strength to stand for the duration of the ceremony. We gathered in the chapel of penitence again. There were only 4 of us now, one having failed the confession engine and been taken away for the unnamed purification. The tattoo artist was an ancient woman, her body more scar tissue than skin, her eyes milky with cataracts, but her hands steady as stone. She worked without anesthetic, using needles she had blessed in holy oil, chanting prayers in a dialect I did not recognize as she drove the ink into our flesh. The design was the symbol of the conclave, a stylized aquila with wings that curved inward as if to embrace or suffocate, surrounded by script that spelled out our new identities. I was no longer whatever name I had been born with. I was Redemptionist Novice 47, and the number was now part of my flesh, my identity reduced to a designation in a ledger. The pain was extraordinary, but I had learned to welcome pain by then, to understand it as a form of communication from the Emperor himself. Each puncture of the needle was a reminder of my weakness, each moment of suffering a prayer offered up through clenched teeth. When it was finished, when the blood had been wiped away and the prayers completed, I looked down at my chest and saw the mark burning there, red and swollen and permanent. I belonged to the conclave now in a way that could not be undone, carried their brand upon my body, would bear it to my grave or beyond if the promises of resurrection through service proved true. The months that followed were more of the same, but intensified, refined, driven deeper into my consciousness through repetition and exhaustion. We prayed 8 times a day, each session lasting 2 hours, our voices rising in unison until individual identity dissolved into collective sound. We studied texts so old the pages crumbled at our touch, learning doctrines that predated the Imperium itself, secrets that the common faithful were never meant to know. We learned that the Emperor was not just a man made divine but divinity made manifest, that his suffering on the Golden Throne was not tragedy but willing sacrifice, that every moment of his agony was a gift that kept humanity alive in a universe that wanted nothing more than to devour us. We learned that doubt was not merely weakness but poison, that questions were weapons the enemy used against the faithful, that certainty, absolute, unshakable certainty, was the only defense against the darkness. We practiced mortification of the flesh, learning to drive the weakness from our bodies through discipline and denial. We fasted for days at a time, subsisting on water and prayer, until hunger became a constant companion that sharpened our minds and stripped away the distractions of physical comfort. We wore hair shirts beneath our robes, the coarse fabric abrading our skin with each movement, a reminder that the body was temporary and worthless. We slept on bare stone, denied ourselves warmth, learned to find ecstasy in discomfort. The logic was simple. The flesh was weak. The flesh was corrupting. The flesh must be mastered and controlled, and ultimately transcended. Only through suffering could we prove our devotion. Only through pain could we touch the divine. I changed during this time, though I did not notice the change happening. It was gradual, a slow erosion of whatever I had been before, replaced by something new and strange. I stopped dreaming, or perhaps I stopped remembering my dreams either way. Sleep became a blank interval between prayer sessions rather than a refuge or an escape. I stopped feeling hunger as discomfort and began to feel it as clarity, as a purification of the senses. I stopped thinking of my body as myself, and began to think of it as a tool, a vehicle for the soul that the Emperor had granted me, something to be used until it broke and then discarded without regret. The other novices underwent similar transformations. We moved through the monastery in near silence, our faces serene with exhaustion and devotion, our eyes turned inward to the growing light of faith that consumed us from within. It was during this period that I first heard the whispers. They came during prayer, subtle at first, easily dismissed as imagination or the echoes of other voices in the chapel. But they persisted, growing louder and more distinct, until I could make out words in languages I had never learned but somehow understood. They spoke of power, of transcendence, of secrets that the conclave was teaching us without ever speaking them aloud. They promised that if we gave ourselves fully, if we surrendered the last vestiges of our individual wills, we would become something greater than human, would join with the Emperor's consciousness, and know the joy of absolute union with the divine. I mentioned the whispers once to the shepherd during confession, hesitant, afraid they might be a sign of corruption. The shepherd simply nodded behind their mask and told me that I was beginning to hear truly, that the whispers were the Emperor's voice filtering through the noise of mortal existence. I should embrace them, surrender to them, let them guide me toward my ultimate purpose. So I did. We all did. We opened ourselves to the whispers, let them fill the spaces where doubt had been, let them reshape our thoughts into patterns that served the conclave's hidden purpose. And with the whispers came visions brief, hallucinatory flashes during prayer or sleep, or the exhausted liminal state between the two. I saw the Emperor not as the propaganda depicted him but as something older and stranger, a vast consciousness that used human forms, the way humans used clothing, donning and discarding them as needed. I saw the Imperium as a machine of faith that devoured souls and converted them into power, into the psychic energy that fed the Astronomicon and held back the darkness beyond the stars. I saw myself and the other novices as components in this machine, our individual existences meaningful only insofar as they contributed to the greater work. These visions should have terrified me. Perhaps once they would have, but I was too far gone by then, too thoroughly reconstructed. Instead, I felt honored to have been shown such truths, privileged to understand the cosmic mechanisms that underpinned reality. The alternative that I was simply losing my mind, fragmenting under the pressure of relentless indoctrination, never occurred to me. Or if it did, I dismissed it immediately. Doubt was heresy. Questioning was weakness. The conclave had given me truth, and truth was absolute, eternal, beyond debate or interpretation. The final test came without warning, as all the most important moments seemed to in the conclave. I woke one night to find an acolyte standing in my cell, their presence impossible. I had locked the door, and there was no other entrance. They said nothing, simply gestured for me to follow. I rose and obeyed, pulling on my robe, padding barefoot through corridors I had never seen before, descending stairs that seemed to go on forever. The temperature dropped as we descended, and the air grew thick with the smell of incense and something else, something organic and sweet like decay. My breath plumed in the cold. My feet grew numb on the stone. Still we descended. We emerged finally in a chamber at the monastery's deepest level, so far below the hive's surface that I could feel the weight of all that metal and stone and humanity pressing down from above. The chamber was circular, its walls carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly, that seemed to writhe and shift when glimpsed peripherally. At the center stood a pool of liquid that glowed with sickly bioluminescence, its surface perfectly still. Around the pool's edge knelt the other novices who had survived this far, 7 of us now, out of the 30 who had begun. We had lost so many, but I could barely remember their faces, could not recall their names if I had ever known them. The shepherd entered through a doorway I had not noticed, and for the first time since that initial night, they removed their mask. The face beneath was human. Technically it possessed eyes and a nose and a mouth, but it was wrong in subtle ways. The proportions slightly off, the skin too smooth, the eyes too bright with reflected light that came from no visible source. When they spoke, their lips did not move quite in sync with the words. "You have been faithful," they said, and their voice was no longer coming from everywhere, but from somewhere else entirely, somewhere behind or beneath the physical form I was seeing. "You have endured. You have proven your worth. Now comes the transformation you were promised. Now comes transcendence." They gestured to the pool. "The water is blessed by 10,000 hours of prayer. It is mixed with oils pressed from plants grown in sacred soil, with blood drawn from saints, with compounds whose formulas are known only to the highest orders. To immerse yourself is to be reborn, to shed the weakness of common humanity and embrace your true purpose. You will emerge as vessels, perfected and purified, ready to carry out the Emperor's work in ways you cannot yet imagine." I looked at the other novices and saw my own uncertainty reflected there, but only for a moment, only a flicker. Then it was gone, replaced by the same serene acceptance we had all been trained to display. Of course we would enter the water. Of course we would accept whatever came next. We had come too far, sacrificed too much, to turn back now. One by one, we disrobed and stepped into the pool. The liquid was cold and thick, viscous like oil, but sliding across the skin with unsettling ease. It burned where it touched, a chemical fire that made me gasp, but I forced myself forward until the fluid was up to my chest, my throat, my lips. I took a breath, the last breath of my old life, though I did not know it then, and submerged myself completely. The world above the surface disappeared. There was only the liquid and the burning and the absolute darkness of total immersion. I opened my eyes beneath the surface and saw nothing, saw everything, saw things I have no words to describe even now. Shapes moved in the darkness, massive and ancient, indifferent to my presence, but aware of it nonetheless. I felt their attention brush against my mind like the touch of some vast, cold hand, and I understood with sudden, terrible clarity that these were the entities the conclave truly served, that the Emperor was a name they used to give us comfort, but the reality was something far older and far stranger. I wanted to scream, wanted to fight my way to the surface and flee, wanted to reclaim my ignorance and my humanity. But my body would not obey me. I was paralyzed in the burning darkness, held in place by will that was not my own, and I felt something entering me through every pore, every opening, every vulnerable membrane. It slithered into my lungs with the liquid I could not help but inhale. It burrowed into my eyes, my ears, the soft tissues of my mouth and nose. It found the places where I was weakest, the cracks in my psyche formed by months of deprivation and indoctrination, and it poured itself in like water into a cracked vessel. I felt myself being filled, replaced, reconstituted from within. The person I had been was dissolving, making room for whatever was growing in its place. When I surfaced, pulled up by the acolytes, because I could no longer move on my own, I was no longer entirely myself. Something else occupied my flesh now, something that wore my thoughts like a comfortable coat, that spoke with my voice but served purposes I could only dimly perceive. I looked at the others emerging from the pool and saw the same transformation reflected in their eyes. A new awareness, ancient and patient, looking out through human faces. We had become what the conclave needed us to be, vessels, hosts, instruments of a will that transcended individual consciousness. We were still alive, still aware, but our agency had been reduced to that of passengers in our own bodies, watching through windows as something else took the controls. The shepherd watched us with satisfaction visible, even on their inhuman face. "Welcome, my children," they said, and I understood now that the shepherd was like us, or perhaps we had become like the shepherd, transformed, possessed, no longer entirely human, but still useful to the powers that guided the conclave. "You are ready now to do the Emperor's work. You are ready to go out into the Imperium and spread his light." They meant it literally, I realized. We would be sent out as missionaries, recruiters, priests of the conclave. We would find others like we had been, desperate, faithful, willing to sacrifice anything for meaning, and we would bring them here to undergo the same transformation. We would expand the conclave's reach, building a network of the converted, creating an army of vessels for whatever forces had claimed us. The following weeks were spent in preparation for this mission. We learned to pass as normal humans, to hide the subtle changes the transformation had wrought in us. We practiced speaking naturally, moving naturally, displaying appropriate emotions at appropriate times. It was harder than it should have been. We had to consciously control expressions and gestures that had once been automatic, had to remember to blink, to breathe in patterns that appeared natural, rather than the efficient rhythms our new masters preferred. We studied the common doctrines of the Imperial Creed, learning to quote them accurately, while subtly twisting their meanings toward the conclave's purposes. We were given false credentials identifying us as wandering preachers, sanctioned by distant ecclesiarchy authorities whose existence could not be easily verified, and we were given our first assignments. I was to return to the mid-hive levels, to the districts I had once called home, and recruit a new generation of the faithful. The irony was not lost on me, or on whatever I had become. I would stand where the recruiters had stood when they claimed me, would speak the same honeyed promises, would bring others to the transformation I had undergone. The thought should have repulsed me. Instead, I felt only a distant sadness, like an echo of emotion from a previous life. The thing inside me felt nothing, or if it did, its feelings were too alien for my human mind to interpret. Before we left, we were granted one final audience with the conclave's inner circle, not the shepherd, but the figures above even them, the ones who dwelt in the monastery's deepest chambers and emerged only for the most sacred occasions. They were barely human anymore, their bodies modified by centuries of transformation, their flesh merged with the same glowing liquid we had been immersed in, until it was impossible to say where their bodies ended and the substance began. They spoke without moving their mouths, their words appearing directly in our minds, and they told us the truth we had already begun to suspect, that the Emperor was real but asleep, that his consciousness was vast but fragmented, that the Imperium's prayers fed him but also fed other things, older things, that had learned to disguise themselves in his image. The conclave served these things, fed them souls like ours, and in return received power, not the crude physical power of weapons and armies, but the deeper power of faith manipulation, of steering human consciousness toward purposes that served the entities beyond the veil. We were told that we should be grateful for this revelation, that we had been chosen for a great work, that our sacrifices would echo through eternity. We nodded and genuflected, and spoke the proper words of thanks. Inside, the last fragments of who I had been screamed and raged and wept, but those fragments were small now, insignificant, easily ignored by the presence that controlled my flesh. I would serve, I would recruit, I would bring others to the transformation. I had no choice, and even if I did, I was no longer capable of choosing resistance. The machinery of indoctrination had done its work too well, had stripped away the parts of me that could refuse, that could question, that could value individual existence over collective purpose. And so, I found myself standing in the mid-hive district of my birth, dressed in the crimson robes of a wandering priest, carrying censers that trailed sweet smoke, speaking promises of transcendence to the desperate and the faithful. I saw recognition in some of the faces, people who had known me before, neighbors and acquaintances from my old life, but they did not recognize me now. The transformation had changed more than my soul. It had altered my features subtly, made me a stranger wearing a familiar face. I recruited 12 in that first week, 20 in the second, 30 by the end of the month. Each one I brought to the conclave, leading them up through the hive's levels to the monastery fortress, where they would undergo the same rituals I had endured, where they would be unmade and remade according to the conclave's needs. I watched each new group go through the process, the prayers, the deprivation, the confession engine, the final immersion in the glowing pool. I watched the light of individual consciousness dim in their eyes, replaced by the ancient awareness that now guided them, and I felt nothing, or perhaps I felt everything but could no longer distinguish one emotion from another, could no longer remember what it meant to be moved by human suffering or human joy. I had become exactly what the conclave needed, a perfect instrument of conversion, neither cruel enough to inspire rebellion, nor kind enough to inspire hope, simply efficient at processing souls into vessels. Months became years, though time had little meaning anymore. I recruited hundreds, maybe thousands, I lost count, and the thing inside me did not care about numbers. I traveled to different hive cities, different worlds, always seeking the desperate and the faithful, always offering the same promises of transcendence and purpose. Some of my recruits survived the transformation. Many did not. The conclave was efficient, but not perfectly so. The human form could only be pushed so far before it broke, and not every soul was compatible with the presence that sought to inhabit it. The failures were disposed of quietly, their bodies rendered down in the monastery's lowest levels, recycled into the components of new rituals. Waste not. Want not everything in the Imperium had a use, even failure. I began to notice patterns in who survived the transformation and who did not. Those who had suffered most in their previous lives, who had been broken and reformed by the Imperium's cruelties, tended to survive better. Their psyches had cracks that the presence could exploit, wounds it could nest in. Those who had been too comfortable, too intact, often rejected the transformation violently, their bodies destroying themselves in immune responses that treated the presence as an infection to be purged. I learned to select for trauma, for damage, for the special kind of desperation that made someone willing to annihilate themselves for the promise of meaning. I became very good at my work, but even instruments wear down eventually. I began to notice changes in myself that went beyond the initial transformation. My memory was fragmenting, losing not just the distant past but recent events, conversations from yesterday becoming hazy and uncertain. My body was degrading in subtle ways, my skin growing dry and papery, my joints stiffening, my vision dimming. The thing inside me was consuming me, using me up like fuel, and when I was spent, it would find another vessel and continue its work. I had perhaps months left, perhaps less, before I became one of those shambling, nearly human figures in the monastery's deepest chambers, kept alive by the presence within me but barely conscious, barely aware of anything except the endless hunger that drove the conclave's work. I found I did not care. Or perhaps I cared very much, but the caring was happening in some locked-away corner of my consciousness, inaccessible to the will that moved my body and spoke my words. I continued my work, recruiting and converting, feeding the conclave's endless appetite for souls. I returned sometimes to the mid-hive district where I had been born, walking through familiar corridors that seemed both unchanged and utterly alien. I looked for my parents once, asked after them in the places where the mid-hive workers gathered, but no one remembered them. They had died, perhaps, or simply vanished into the Imperium's grinding machinery, rendered into protein paste, or pressed into some manufactorum's walls, or shipped off to fight in wars on planets whose names they would never know. It did not matter. They had been as replaceable as I was, as everyone was. On one of these visits, I encountered someone I had recruited in those first weeks, a woman whose name I had forgotten but whose face I remembered from the expression of hope she had worn when I made her the same promises that had been made to me. She was working now as a recruiter like myself, dressed in crimson robes, speaking honeyed words to a new generation of desperate faithful. She did not recognize me. I did not make myself known. We were not individuals anymore, but copies of the same template, interchangeable parts in a machine that served purposes beyond human comprehension. There was a kind of horrible comfort in this, in the absolute erasure of responsibility, in the knowledge that nothing I did mattered because I was not really doing it. I was being done through, used by forces that had existed before humanity learned to speak, and would exist long after the last human voice fell silent. I write this now in one of the rare moments when the presence withdraws slightly, when I am granted a brief window of clarity and autonomy. I do not know why it permits these moments. Perhaps it needs the human consciousness to remain somewhat intact, to function properly. Perhaps it enjoys the suffering that comes from awareness. Perhaps it is simply a flaw in the transformation process. Whatever the reason, in these moments I am myself again, or what remains of myself, and I remember everything I have done, everyone I have condemned to the same fate I endure. The guilt is crushing, absolute, but also pointless. There is no redemption for me, no escape, no undoing what has been done. I am damned, and I have damned hundreds of others, and the cycle will continue long after I am consumed entirely. If you are reading this, you have likely been approached by recruiters like I became. Perhaps they wore crimson robes and spoke of transcendence. Perhaps they offered you something better than the grinding misery of your current existence. Perhaps their promises sounded too good to be true, but you were too desperate to care. I am telling you now, refuse them, flee from them. Whatever they offer is not worth the price you will pay. The Imperium is vast and cruel and indifferent, but at least in its conventional horrors you remain yourself. You retain the possibility of choice, however constrained. What the Conclave offers is worse than death. It is the death of self. While the body continues, it is eternal service to things that care nothing for your suffering or your soul. But I know you will not listen, just as I did not listen to whatever warnings might have been available. Desperation makes us deaf to caution, and the Imperium generates desperation by design, breeding the very conditions that make people vulnerable to promises of transcendence. You will take their hand as I took the hand of the recruiter who damned me. You will sign your name in their registry. You will ascend to their monastery and undergo their rituals. You will emerge transformed, a vessel for ancient hungers, and you will do to others what was done to you. The cycle is perfect, self-sustaining, and there is no escape except in the total annihilation that the Imperium reserves for heretics and traitors. I am neither heretic nor traitor, or perhaps I am both. I no longer have the clarity to distinguish. I serve the Emperor, in a way, or serve things that wear his name as a disguise. Does it matter? In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, only faith wielded as a weapon, only the grinding of souls into fuel for machines both mechanical and spiritual. The Imperium devours its own children and calls it righteousness. The Conclave is merely more honest about the consumption, more direct in its transformation of human beings into instruments of inhuman will. The presence is returning now, I can feel it stirring, reclaiming control over my thoughts and actions. This moment of clarity is ending. Soon I will be a passenger again, watching through windows as something else directs my body toward purposes I can only dimly perceive. I will recruit more souls. I will feed the machine. I will continue until the flesh fails and the presence moves on to a fresher vessel, leaving behind a husk that barely remembers what it once was. My name was something that began with a hard consonant, something that felt solid in the mouth. I had parents who prayed before breakfast and died forgotten. I was 23 when I chose transcendence over misery, transformation over the slow death of meaningless labor. I thought I was ascending. I thought I was becoming something greater than myself. In a way, I was right. But the thing I became has no use for the person I was, and that person is dying by degrees, erased piece by piece to make room for something ancient and patient and utterly devoid of human concern. This is my confession, my warning, my testament. I was real once. I chose this, in the way a drowning man chooses to grasp at chains, because even chains offer something to hold on to when you are sinking. The Imperium offers no good choices, only degrees of damnation, and I chose the variety that promised meaning. I was wrong. There is no meaning, only function. There is no transcendence, only replacement. There is no salvation, only service that continues past the point where the servant has been consumed entirely. Remember me, if you can. Remember that I was human before I became a tool. Remember that every recruiter you encounter wearing crimson robes was once as desperate as you are, as willing to believe impossible promises, as eager to escape the grinding horror of existence in the Imperium's lower levels. We are victims and perpetrators both, damned and damning others, trapped in a cycle that feeds on faith and produces only suffering. The Emperor protects, they say, but he did not protect me. The Emperor provides, they claim, but he provided only transformation into something that wears my skin like a coat. I am running out of time. The presence is nearly fully returned, my window of autonomy closing like a wound. My last thought, my final human thought before I am subsumed again into the collective purpose that drives the Conclave's work, is this: resist, whatever they promise, however desperate you are, however meaningless your life seems in the vast machinery of the Imperium. Resist. Die on the assembly line if you must. Let the manufactorum grind you down. Starve in the underhive, or burn in some pointless war. Any death is better than the living death I endure, any suffering preferable to the suffering of awareness without agency, of watching yourself commit atrocities while powerless to stop. But you will not resist, because I did not resist, because none of us resist when the moment comes. We are too broken, too desperate, too ready to believe that somewhere in this nightmare Imperium there exists something better, something transcendent, something worth the price. And so the cycle continues, fed by hope weaponized against the hopeful, faith twisted into a mechanism of corruption, salvation revealed as damnation in disguise. I was human once. Remember that. Remember me. Remember that every monster was made, not born, and that the Imperium makes monsters by the billion to feed its endless appetite for suffering. I am one of those monsters now, complicit and condemned, and I will go on being a monster until the flesh fails and the presence finds a new home. There is no forgiveness for what I have done. There is no redemption for what I have become. There is only this warning, written in a moment of clarity, cast into the void in the vain hope that someone might read it and understand and choose differently. But they will not. And the conclave will continue, and the Imperium will grind on, and in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, only faith, only the eternal consumption of souls to feed gods that care nothing for the consumed. This is my testimony. This is my confession. This is the truth that cost me everything to learn and everything to speak. Transcendence is a lie. Salvation is a trap, and the only escape from the Imperium's horrors is to refuse the promises that sound too beautiful to be real, because they are not real, they are bait. And I took that bait, and it hooked me through the soul, and I have been reeling ever since, toward depths I cannot fathom, and cannot escape. May the Emperor have mercy on what remains of my soul. May someone, someday, break this cycle. May my suffering mean something more than fuel for machines that should never have been built. But I know it will not. Nothing means anything except service. Nothing matters except function. And I have been reduced to my function, a tool in the hands of forces beyond human understanding, wearing a human face as camouflage, while serving purposes that would drive sane minds to madness if fully comprehended. This is what I am. This is what you will become, if you follow where I followed. Remember that. Remember me. Remember that monsters weep sometimes, in the brief moments when they remember they were human. The presence has returned fully now. I am writing these final words as it reclaims my thoughts, my will, my agency. I can feel myself fading, the observer disappearing into the observed, the passenger merging with the vehicle until there is no distinction left. This is the last time I will be capable of clarity, of individual thought, of anything resembling the person I once was. From this moment forward, I am only a vessel, a tool, a function in the service of powers that exist beyond names and beyond mercy. If you are reading this, know that I tried to warn you. Know that I failed, as I have failed at everything that mattered. Know that the Imperium offers no good choices, and that the choice I made was among the worst available. And know that I am sorry, desperately sorry, hopelessly sorry, for everyone I brought to this fate, everyone whose hope I weaponized against them, everyone whose faith I twisted into chains. But sorrow changes nothing. The machine continues. The cycle perpetuates, and in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, and I am one of its weapons, aimed at the hearts of the faithful, destroying souls in the name of salvation that never comes. This is my testimony. This is the truth. This is the price of transcendence in the Imperium of man. May the Emperor forgive me. I cannot forgive myself.